Okay, so someone's been doing their research. Articles and research, even your own notes on cousin marriage. Wow. Looks like you've really gone deep down that rabbit hole, but hey, it can be a lot to sort through, right? So that's where we come in with this deep dive. It's all about pulling out those really fascinating, pure gold nuggets about cousin marriage.
Exactly. And we'll be looking at where this practice is most common around the world, the history and culture behind it all. It's a fascinating mix, and we'll also be talking about how all of this plays out differently for men and women.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
Did you know that back in 19th century England, marrying your cousin wasn't just acceptable? It was actually seen as a way to keep wealth and power consolidated within families?
Almost like royal marriages today.
That's a great comparison. It really highlights how what's considered taboo in one time and place can be perfectly normal in another.
Right, and your research does show that cousin marriage was surprisingly common in Europe and the U.S. just a couple centuries ago. About 10% of marriages, in fact.
Wow, 10%. So not some rare fringe thing at all. But then things shifted, right? It seems like today, at least in the West, it's viewed very differently.
Exactly. Over the 20th century, social norms changed, and concerns about genetic risks grew, leading to its decline in Western societies. But that historical context is important because it helps us understand the global picture today.
Okay, so let's look at that global picture. You helped me put together a chart based on your research showing the top 30 countries with the highest rates of cousin marriage. And it's striking how concentrated it is in certain regions.
Absolutely. The Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia really stand out. Pakistan has the highest rate, somewhere between 38 and 40%.
Mm.
And it's interesting to note that while India is on the list, it actually has the lowest rate among those top 30, only around 10 to 12%.
That's a pretty big difference, especially considering their neighboring countries. It makes me wonder if the religious landscape plays a role here. Your research mentions that Islam permits and sometimes encourages cousin marriage, while Hinduism traditionally prohibits it.
That's a really sharp observation, and you're spot on. Religious influence is definitely a factor. The Prophet Muhammad, for example, married his cousin, which has had a lasting impact on Islamic tradition. And in India, where Hinduism is dominant, that religious prohibition likely contributes to the lower rates we see.
It's amazing how religion can have such a powerful influence on social norms, even when it comes to something as personal as marriage. But I know from your notes that it's not just religion. Cultural norms and economic factors also play a huge role, particularly in these regions where family ties are so central to social life.
Absolutely. One of your sources had a really insightful quote about this, saying, "In these societies, cousin marriage isn't just about romantic love. It's about preserving family honor, protecting women within the family structure, and consolidating wealth."
That makes sense. If you're marrying your cousin, you're keeping things within the family, maintaining those strong bonds. But that also brings up the question of whether this practice can limit a woman's autonomy and choices, especially in more patriarchal societies. Your research does touch upon the potential downsides, right?
Yes, it definitely does. While some argue that marrying within the family provides women with a built-in support system and a sense of security, others raise concerns about potential coercion and limited choices. It's definitely a complex issue with no easy answers.
Okay, so we've got this mix of religious influence, cultural norms, and potential gender dynamics at play. What about the economic side of things? Your notes highlight how cousin marriage is particularly relevant in agrarian societies.
Right. Think about it this way. In rural communities where agriculture is the primary source of livelihood, keeping land and resources within the family is paramount. Cousin marriage helps prevent the fragmentation of property and minimizes inheritance disputes.
So it's a practical way to ensure economic stability across generations. It's like a strategic alliance, not just a romantic union.
Exactly. And that brings us to the legal framework, which also varies significantly around the world. And many of the countries on your chart, it's either legal or there are no strict enforcements against cousin marriage. In contrast, many Western nations have laws prohibiting it, which has contributed to its decline there.
It's fascinating how all these forces, religion, culture, economics, and law, come together to shape global patterns of cousin marriage. But before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I have to bring up something you mentioned earlier about genetic risks. There's a common belief that cousin marriage automatically leads to serious birth defects. But your research suggests it's more nuanced than that, right?
It is. One of your sources, a study on birth defects, showed that while there is a slightly elevated risk for offspring of first cousins, it's only about 3 to 4% compared to 2 to 3% in the general population.
Wait, really? That's a much smaller difference than I expected. I think this is where those Blinkist-level insights come in. It challenges our assumptions and makes us rethink what we thought we knew.
Exactly. And there's even more nuance to it. In communities with repeated cousin marriages over generations, the cumulative risk may increase. So it's not just about one generation, it's about the long-term impact on a family line.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface here, and there's so much more to explore. But that's a conversation for part 2 of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm really excited to jump back into our deep dive on cousin marriage. We've covered so much ground already, but I'm particularly intrigued by this idea of looking at it through a gender lens. What stood out to you in your research?
One of the most striking things was how cousin marriage impacts women differently, depending on the specific cultural context. You highlighted a study that found in some societies it can actually offer a greater degree of freedom and agency.
That's so interesting. It seems counterintuitive considering we just discussed the potential for limited choices. How does that work?
Well, in some cultures, particularly those where women's mobility is restricted, marrying a cousin allows them to stay within their familiar social circle. They maintain close ties with their family and have more say in household matters.
So it's like they're navigating the existing power structures to their advantage. Exactly. There was an anecdote in your research about a woman in a rural community who, through her marriage to her cousin, was able to inherit and manage her family's land, something unheard of for women in that society otherwise.
Wow, that's a powerful example of how cousin marriage can actually empower women in certain situations. But of course, this isn't the universal experience. Your notes also mentioned a study that looked at forced cousin marriages where women were pressured into these unions against their will.
Yes, and that's a crucial point. It really underscores the complexity of this issue. Forced marriage, regardless of whether it involves cousins or not, is a violation of human rights. And unfortunately, it's something that occurs in various cultures and contexts around the world.
That's a sobering reminder that we need to be careful about making generalizations. Cousin marriage isn't inherently good or bad. It all depends on the specific circumstances and the level of agency involved.
Absolutely. And I think that same principle applies when we consider how cousin marriage impacts men. On the one hand, it can strengthen social and economic ties, as we discussed earlier. But on the other hand, it can also create a sense of obligation and pressure, limiting men's choices as well.
You know, one of the things that keeps coming up in your research is this tension between individual choice and societal expectations. It seems like that tension is at the heart of so much of the debate around cousin marriage.
I agree. It's a classic struggle between tradition and modernity. And as the world becomes increasingly globalized and interconnected, that tension is only likely to intensify.
Speaking of fascinating facts and challenging assumptions, there were a couple things in your research that really surprised me. For instance, the fact that rates of cousin marriage can vary significantly within a single country. Why is that?
Your research had a really interesting case study from Pakistan that sheds light on this. In rural areas where traditional values and family ties are often stronger, rates of cousin marriage can be as high as 50%. But in urban centers like Karachi or Lahore, where there's more exposure to education, diverse cultural influences, and economic opportunities, the rates are much lower.
So it's not just about national trends, it's also about regional variations and the interplay of different social forces.
Precisely. And that same nuance applies when we look at cultural preferences within different communities. One of your sources mentioned a distinction between parallel and cross-cousin marriage, particularly in some Muslim-majority countries.
Right. I remember reading about that, but to be honest, I didn't fully grasp the significance. Can you break it down for me?
Sure. So parallel cousin marriage refers to marrying the child of your father's brother or your mother's sister. This type of marriage was often favored because it kept property and inheritance within a specific lineage, particularly in patriarchal societies where lineage was traced through the male line.
So it's not just about marrying a cousin, it's about very specific familial connections.
Exactly. And then you have cross-cousin marriage, which refers to marrying the child of your father's sister or your mother's brother. This form of marriage was more common in societies where kinship systems were structured differently.
It's like a whole different set of cultural rules and logic. What factors might have contributed to these varying preferences?
There are a number of theories, and one of the most intriguing ones relates to social alliance formation. In some cultures, cross-cousin marriage was encouraged as a way to build alliances between different families or clans. It was a way to forge political ties, resolve disputes, or expand trading networks.
It's fascinating how marriage practices can be so deeply intertwined with social and political structures, and it makes me wonder, as societies evolve and these structures change, will those marriage practices adapt as well?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we'll delve into more deeply in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into cousin marriage. We've covered a lot of ground, from global patterns to historical context, from cultural nuances to gender dynamics. But the question that keeps lingering in my mind is this: what does the future hold for this age-old practice?
That's a great question, and it's one that your research actually delves into quite a bit. One of your sources, a sociologist who studies marriage patterns, argues that we're at a crossroads. As the world becomes increasingly interconnected and globalized, traditional practices like cousin marriage are facing new challenges and opportunities.
It's like that push and pull between tradition and modernity that we talked about earlier, right? On the one hand, you have globalization, which exposes people to different cultures and ideas, potentially leading to a questioning of long-held norms. But on the other hand, globalization can also trigger a defensive reaction, causing people to cling even more tightly to their traditions.
Exactly. And it's not just globalization. Your research also highlighted the impact of education, particularly for women. As access to education expands, people tend to have more choices and agency in their lives, including the choice of whom to marry.
Right. Education empowers individuals to make their own decisions rather than simply following the dictates of tradition. But it's not just about individual choices, is it? There are also larger societal shifts happening that could play a role in shaping the future of cousin marriage.
Absolutely. One of the biggest trends is urbanization. As more and more people move from rural areas to cities, they're exposed to a more diverse and often more individualistic environment. Those tightly knit social structures that often support cousin marriage can start to weaken.
It makes me think of that study from Pakistan that we discussed earlier, showing how rates of cousin marriage are significantly lower in urban areas compared to rural areas.
That's a great example of how urbanization can influence these patterns. And then, of course, there's technology. The rise of social media, online dating platforms, and other communication tools has revolutionized how people connect and form relationships.
It's like the world has become a much smaller place, and the pool of potential partners has expanded exponentially. It makes me wonder if technology could lead to a decline in cousin marriage simply because people have more options available to them.
That's certainly a possibility. But on the flip side, technology could also be used to reinforce traditional practices. For instance, online communities and platforms could connect cousins who live far apart, facilitating marriages that might not have happened otherwise.
So it's a double-edged sword. Technology can both challenge and reinforce existing social norms depending on how it's used. It seems like predicting the future of cousin marriage is no easy feat. There are so many factors at play, and the outcome is likely to vary depending on the specific cultural context.
I agree. It's a complex and evolving issue, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer. But your research did offer some intriguing insights into potential future scenarios. One of the most thought-provoking ideas was the concept of hybridity.
Hybridity. What does that mean in the context of cousin marriage?
It refers to the blending of traditional practices with modern values. For example, in some communities, we're seeing a shift towards what some call arranged love marriages, where families still play a role in matchmaking, but individuals have more say in the final decision.
So it's a kind of compromise between maintaining those family ties and honoring individual autonomy. It's fascinating to see how these traditions are adapting to changing social landscapes.
It really is, and I think it highlights the resilience and adaptability of human cultures. Cousin marriage, like any social practice, is not static. It evolves and transforms in response to the world around it.
That's a great point. We've spent these last 3 parts delving deep into this practice, exploring its history, its cultural variations, its benefits, and its drawbacks. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that there's no simple answer, no black and white judgment to be made. Cousin marriage is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon shaped by a web of interconnected factors.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's a reminder that we need to approach these issues with nuanced understanding and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
Well said. This has been an incredibly enlightening journey, and I want to thank you for guiding me through this deep dive. And a huge thank you to you, our listener, for bringing this fascinating topic to our attention.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you both.
And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. Until next time, happy exploring.